Whispers of the White Cliffs. The chalk cliffs of Dover stood sentinel against the pewter sky, their white faces catching the last whispers of daylight as summer surrendered to evening in 1940. From these ancient heights, you could see across the narrow strait to the continent, where the machinery of war was gathering like storm clouds on a distant horizon. The English Channel, that 21-mile moat that had protected Britain for 1,000 years, suddenly felt as fragile as morning mist. In the gathering dusk, figures moved along the cliff tops. Not tourists admiring the view, but members of the Royal Observer Corps, ordinary citizens who had volunteered to become the eyes and ears of a nation under siege. They carried binoculars, notebooks, and an intimate knowledge of aircraft silhouettes that would soon mean the difference between life and death for millions below. These were shopkeepers and teachers, farmers and clerks who had transformed themselves into Britain's first line of defense through nothing more than dedication and careful study. The summer of 1940 held a peculiar quality, a tension that seemed to vibrate in the very air. Hitler's armies had swept across Europe with mechanical precision, crushing Poland in weeks, overwhelming France in a matter of months. The Wehrmacht now controlled the coastline from Norway to the Spanish border, and their guns could be seen glinting in the French ports just across the water. Britain stood alone, and everyone knew it. But isolation breeds a particular kind of clarity. And in that clarity, desperate decisions were being made in the corridors of Whitehall and the airfields of southern England. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the methodical Scotsman who commanded RAF Fighter Command, understood the mathematics of survival with brutal precision. He had perhaps 700 operational fighters against the Luftwaffe's overwhelming numerical superiority. Every pilot, every aircraft, every gallon of aviation fuel had to be deployed with the calculated efficiency of a chess master facing an opponent with twice as many pieces. The British pilots were good, exceptionally good, but there simply weren't enough of them. The pre-war RAF had been built for quality over quantity, producing superbly trained aviators through a rigorous system that took years to complete. Now, with German bombers already probing British airspace and invasion barges massing in French ports, there was no time for the luxury of lengthy training programs. It was into this crucible of necessity that an unexpected solution began to emerge, one that would challenge every assumption about nationality, loyalty, and the very nature of aerial warfare. They arrived in small groups throughout the late spring and early summer. These foreign pilots who had somehow escaped the collapse of their homelands. Poles, Czechs, Norwegians, French, Belgians. Men who had watched their air forces destroyed, their countries occupied, their families scattered or worse. They came by fishing boat and submarine, through neutral countries and circuitous routes that read like adventure novels. They arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and a burning desire to continue the fight. The Polish pilots presented the most intriguing puzzle. Poland's air force had been annihilated in the September campaign of 1939, but many of its aviators had escaped, first to Romania, then to France, where they had flown with distinction during the brief campaign that ended with France's capitulation. Now they found themselves in Britain, speaking a language few Britons understood, carrying credentials from air forces that no longer existed, claiming combat experience that seemed almost too extensive to believe. Squadron leader Ronald Kellett, tasked with evaluating these foreign volunteers, found himself confronting a fundamental challenge of military bureaucracy. How do you assess the qualifications of a pilot whose logbooks are written in Polish, whose training was conducted according to different standards, whose combat experience was gained in aircraft that Britain didn't operate? The traditional RAF evaluation process, designed for products of the British training system, seemed woefully inadequate. The language barrier created its own peculiar difficulties. Technical aviation terminology, precise and unforgiving under the best of circumstances, became a minefield of potential misunderstanding when filtered through interpreters and phrasebooks. The difference between Angels 15 and Bandits at 15,000 could mean the difference between a successful intercept and a catastrophic mistake. Radio communications, the nervous system of coordinated air defense, required split-second understanding and instantaneous response. Yet something in the bearing of these Polish pilots suggested capabilities that transcended paperwork and language difficulties. They moved with the unconscious confidence of men who had already faced death in aerial combat and survived. Their questions about British aircraft revealed an intimate understanding of aviation that couldn't be faked. When they spoke among themselves in their rapid, consonant-heavy language, their gestures traced the universal grammar of aerial tactics. The banking turn, the diving attack, the defensive spiral that every fighter pilot understood, regardless of nationality. The skepticism was mutual, of course. These Polish aviators had witnessed the destruction of their homeland despite assurances of British and French support. They had fought alongside French pilots who, despite individual courage, had been overwhelmed by German tactical superiority and numerical advantage. Now they found themselves in a country that seemed to be repeating many of the same mistakes, dispersing its forces, underestimating German capabilities, clinging to tactical doctrines that had already proven inadequate against the Luftwaffe's innovative methods. The British aircraft themselves presented both opportunities and challenges. The Hawker Hurricane, sturdy and reliable, bore some resemblance to the fighters these men had flown before. Its controls responded in familiar ways. Its handling characteristics fell within the bounds of their experience. But the Supermarine Spitfire, the Spitfire was something entirely different. Here was a fighter that seemed to embody a new philosophy of aerial combat, built for speed and agility rather than ruggedness and firepower. In the dispersal huts of RAF stations across southern England, an extraordinary process of mutual education began to unfold. British pilots, products of peacetime training that emphasized formation flying and textbook tactics, found themselves learning from men who had developed their skills in the unforgiving crucible of actual combat. The Poles spoke of German tactics that weren't in any British manual, the way Messerschmitt 109s would use their superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage, the coordinated attacks that combined bombers and fighters in mutually supporting formations, the psychological warfare of precision bombing designed to shatter civilian morale. But the exchange flowed both directions. The British possessed something equally valuable: a systematic approach to air defense that integrated radar, ground control, and fighter squadrons into a coordinated network. This was warfare as engineering problem, solved through methodical application of technology and organization rather than individual heroics. The Polish pilots, accustomed to fighting as lone wolves or in small independent formations, began to grasp the possibilities inherent in this more structured approach. The radar stations that dotted the British coast represented a revolution in aerial warfare that few fully understood at the time. These ungainly steel towers, looking more like industrial accidents than military installations, could detect incoming aircraft at ranges that seemed almost magical to pilots accustomed to relying solely on visual identification. The ability to vector fighters toward incoming threats with mathematical precision transformed air defense from a desperate game of chance into something approaching a science. Yet technology alone couldn't solve the fundamental equation of aerial combat. At some point, individual pilot skill and determination would determine the outcome of each engagement. The question that haunted Dowding and his staff was whether these foreign pilots, however skilled, however motivated, could integrate effectively into a system built around British procedures, British communications, and British tactical doctrine. The summer days grew longer, and with them came increasing signs that the German offensive was imminent. Reconnaissance flights probed deeper into British airspace, testing response times and defensive capabilities. Luftwaffe formations appeared over the Channel with increasing frequency, forcing RAF squadrons to scramble in response to contacts that often proved to be feints or diversions. The psychological pressure was enormous, like waiting for an avalanche while listening to the mountain groan and shift above. In this atmosphere of mounting tension, the Polish pilots found themselves caught between worlds. They were not quite trusted with full operational responsibilities, yet too experienced to waste in routine training exercises. They flew practice missions and familiarization flights, learning the peculiarities of British aircraft, while their new colleagues learned to work alongside men whose backgrounds remained largely mysterious. The evening light was fading now along the Dover cliffs, painting the chalk faces in shades of rose and gold. The Observer Corps volunteers maintained their patient vigil, scanning the darkening channel for signs of movement. Somewhere across that narrow strip of water, German aircrew were receiving their final briefings, checking their equipment, preparing for operations that would begin at dawn. And in the dispersal huts and ready rooms of fighter command, British and Polish pilots shared the timeless ritual of warriors on the eve of battle, checking equipment, writing letters, playing cards, and trying not to think too hard about what tomorrow might bring. The language barriers remained, the cultural differences persisted, but something deeper was beginning to emerge, a recognition that courage transcends nationality, and that in the crucible of aerial combat, skill and determination matter more than the color of one's uniform or the accent of one's voice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every assumption about aerial warfare, national identity, and the bonds that unite men in common cause. The Eagle's Shadow. As dawn broke over the English Channel on July 10, 1940, the first phase of what would become known as the Battle of Britain began in earnest. The Luftwaffe's initial strategy was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. Rather than launching massive formations against London immediately, German commanders chose to test British defences through calculated strikes against shipping convoys and coastal installations. The logic was sound from their perspective: control the Channel, strangle Britain's maritime lifelines, and the island nation would weaken before the main assault began. Convoy Bread steamed slowly through the Dover Strait that morning, its merchant vessels heavy with precious cargo, escorted by a handful of destroyers whose crews scanned the horizon with growing unease. 20 miles away, deep beneath the Kent countryside, a different kind of battle was already underway. In the operations room at RAF Bentley Priory, the nerve center of fighter command, a quiet revolution in warfare was unfolding. The room itself was unremarkable, low-ceilinged, filled with plotting tables and telephone equipment. But here, for the first time in military history, an entire air defense system could be coordinated through real-time intelligence. The key to this system lay in a network of radar stations, or RDF as it was still called then, radio direction finding, that dotted the British coastline like electronic sentinels. These tall steel towers, their latticed frames reaching toward the sky, could detect aircraft formations at distances previously unimaginable. What had once been guesswork, where would the enemy strike, when would they come, was now becoming science. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding understood this transformation better than anyone. At 60 years of age, Stuffy Dowding possessed the rare combination of technical acumen and strategic vision that the moment demanded. While other senior officers still thought in terms of the last war, massed formations and gentlemanly aerial duels, Dowding had spent years preparing for something entirely different. His system was elegant in its complexity. Radar stations would detect incoming formations and relay their positions to sector stations. Filter rooms would process this information, separating genuine threats from false echoes. Controllers would then vector fighter squadrons to intercept, not randomly, but with mathematical precision based on speed, altitude, and bearing calculations. But on this July morning, as German Dornier bombers approached Convoy Bread with their Messerschmitt escorts weaving protective patterns above, the system faced its first serious test. In the operations room, Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters moved wooden blocks across large-scale maps, each block representing aircraft formations whose positions were updated every few minutes through a network of telephone lines and radio transmissions. The tension was palpable. Squadron Leader Park, at 11 Group Headquarters, watched the developing situation with the focused intensity of a chess master. The German formation was substantial, perhaps 40 aircraft in total, and their intentions were becoming clear. They were heading directly for the convoy. Scramble 74 Squadron, came the order through the telephone network. At Hornchurch Airfield, pilots who had been lounging in deck chairs beside their Spitfires suddenly sprang into action. Flight Sergeant Smith, a veteran of the early war operations, led his section into the air with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, 12 fighters were climbing hard toward the Channel, their Merlin engines creating that distinctive growl that would soon become synonymous with British resistance. What followed was not the romantic aerial ballet that popular imagination might suggest, but rather a brutal test of training, technology, and nerve. The Spitfires intercepted the German formation at 18,000 feet, high enough that the men needed oxygen, cold enough that their breath fogged their windscreens despite the summer warmth below. Flight Sergeant Smith later described the encounter in his combat report. clinical language that barely conveyed the chaos of high-speed combat. Engaged enemy aircraft at 10:47 hours, opened fire at 250 yards on Dornier 215, observed strikes on port engine and fuselage. Enemy aircraft broke formation and descended towards sea level. But the real significance of this engagement lay not in its tactical details, but in what it revealed about the evolving nature of aerial warfare. For the first time, British fighters had been directed to their targets not by chance or patrol patterns, but through coordinated ground control. The radar chain had worked. The filter system had processed the information correctly, and controllers had successfully vectored fighters to intercept. Back in the operations room at Bentley Priory, Dowding studied the reports with characteristic calm. His staff officers buzzed with excitement over the successful interception, but the Air Chief Marshal's expression remained thoughtful. He understood that this was merely the opening move in what would become a prolonged campaign of attrition. The German strategy was becoming clearer with each passing day. Reichsmarschall Göring's plan called for a systematic destruction of RAF Fighter Command through three distinct phases. First, attacks on shipping and coastal targets to draw British fighters into combat and assess their capabilities. Second, concentrated strikes against airfields and radar installations to cripple the defense system itself. Finally, terror bombing of cities to break civilian morale and force political capitulation. Dowding's challenge was to husband his resources, to inflict maximum damage on the Luftwaffe while preserving enough strength for the decisive battles that lay ahead. Every pilot lost, every aircraft damaged, represented an irreplaceable asset in a war of mathematics as much as courage. The human cost of this strategic calculus was already becoming apparent. In squadron ready rooms across southern England, young men barely out of their teens studied intelligence reports that spoke of German formations numbering in the hundreds. They calculated fuel loads and ammunition supplies with the same methodical precision their opponents employed, knowing that miscalculation meant not just mission failure, but death. Yet something remarkable was emerging from this pressure. The cultural barriers that had seemed so significant just weeks earlier were dissolving under the shared stress of combat operations. Polish pilots found themselves flying wing to wing with public school graduates from Surrey. Czech airmen shared technical knowledge with Scottish mechanics who could barely pronounce their names. Squadron leader Malan, a South African whose tactical innovations would soon influence fighter operations throughout the RAF, observed this transformation with professional interest. "The airplane doesn't care about your accent," he noted in his diary. "At 300 miles per hour, with Messerschmitts on your tail, what matters is whether the man beside you knows his business." This practical brotherhood was extending beyond the cockpit. In the operations rooms, where split-second decisions determined whether fighters would find their targets or wander uselessly through empty sky, controllers were learning to interpret the voices of pilots whose English carried the inflections of Warsaw, Prague, or Brussels. Communication was becoming more than language. It was developing into a shared understanding of tactical necessity. As the sun set over the channel that evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the day's lessons were being absorbed at every level of the command structure. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated its capabilities, but so had RAF Fighter Command. The stage was now set for an escalation that would test every assumption about modern warfare, and every bond that united the defenders of Britain in their common cause, Hurricane's call. The Hurricane was not the most elegant aircraft ever built, but in the hands of a skilled pilot, it became something approaching poetry in motion. Where the Spitfire drew admiring glances with its elliptical wings and graceful curves, the Hurricane possessed a different kind of beauty. The beauty of purpose, of reliability, of a machine designed to do one thing supremely well. Squadron leader Witold Urbanowicz understood this distinction better than most. The Polish ace had first encountered the Hurricane during those early training flights at Northolt, and what struck him immediately was not its appearance, but its voice. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine spoke with a deep, authoritative growl that seemed to vibrate through the pilot's very bones. It was the sound of 12 cylinders working in perfect harmony, of nearly 1,100 horsepower channeled through a propeller that bit into the air with mechanical precision. The cockpit of a Hurricane was a study in functional design. No unnecessary flourishes, just the essential instruments arranged within easy reach of a pilot who might need to make life-or-death decisions in fractions of seconds. The control column felt solid in one's grip, connected directly to the aircraft's control surfaces through cables and pulleys that translated the pilot's intentions into movement with reassuring immediacy. When you pulled back on the stick, the Hurricane climbed. When you pushed the rudder pedals, it turned. There was an honesty to the machine that inspired confidence, but it was the view that truly defined the Hurricane experience. The greenhouse canopy provided exceptional visibility, crucial when scanning the skies for the telltale glint of sunlight on enemy wings. Sitting in that cockpit, a pilot could see the patchwork of English countryside spread below like a living map. The neat hedgerows dividing fields of green and gold, the ribbon of the Thames catching the morning light, the sprawling expanse of London stretching toward the horizon. Urbanowicz had grown to appreciate these views during his conversion training. The Polish pilot possessed qualities that marked him as a natural leader. Not just the flying skills honed during the desperate defense of his homeland, but the rarer ability to inspire confidence in others. His English was improving daily, and with it came a growing understanding of the tactical situation facing RAF Fighter Command. The Hurricane squadrons were the backbone of Dowding's defensive system. While Spitfire squadrons often received the headlines, it was the Hurricane units that bore much of the operational burden. They were more numerous, more readily available, and in many ways better suited to the kind of fighting that characterized the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring its pilot home. Its fabric-covered rear fuselage could be riddled with bullets and continue flying, while its thick wings housed fuel tanks that were less vulnerable to catastrophic damage than those of other aircraft. More importantly, the Hurricane was an exceptional gun platform. 8 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, could deliver a devastating concentration of fire when properly aimed. The aircraft remained steady during firing passes, allowing pilots to track their targets with precision. In the hands of an experienced aviator like Urbanowicz, it became a formidable weapon of aerial warfare. The first major test of these capabilities came during the 3rd week of August, as the Luftwaffe began to shift its tactics. Intelligence reports suggested that German commanders were growing frustrated with their inability to achieve the quick victory they had anticipated. The radar chain continued to function. Fighter Command continued to respond to every probe and attack with coordinated interceptions. It was during one of these engagements that Urbanowicz first demonstrated the leadership qualities that would soon earn him command of his own squadron. Flying as part of a mixed formation, British and Polish pilots working in perfect coordination, he spotted the incoming raid while it was still 20 miles from the English coast. The radar operators had done their job, but it was the human element that would determine the outcome of the next few minutes. The German formation was substantial, perhaps 40 aircraft in total, with Heinkel bombers escorted by Messerschmitt fighters flying in stepped formations above and behind. It was exactly the kind of tactical challenge that required split-second decision-making and flawless execution. The Hurricane pilots had altitude advantage, approaching from out of the sun, but they would need to coordinate their attack perfectly to achieve maximum effect. Urbanovich's voice came through the radio with calm authority, his accented English cutting through the static with unmistakable clarity. He had identified the optimal approach vector, a diving attack that would allow the Hurricane formation to engage the escort fighters while maintaining enough energy to escape if the tactical situation deteriorated. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came from hard-won experience, from understanding both the capabilities of one's own aircraft and the likely responses of the enemy. The engagement that followed lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though to the pilots involved it seemed both instantaneous and eternal. The Hurricane formation dove from 25,000 feet, building speed as they closed the distance to their targets. The Merlin engines sang their mechanical song, propellers carving through the thin air with increasing velocity. In those moments of approach, each pilot was alone with his thoughts, alone with the vibration of his aircraft and the growing tension of impending combat. What struck observers later was not the violence of the encounter, but the precision with which it was executed. The Hurricane pilots worked as a coordinated team, each aircraft playing its assigned role in a tactical ballet that had been rehearsed countless times in training. They engaged their targets with professional competence, broke off when the tactical situation required it, and reformed for the flight back to base with the kind of discipline that spoke to hours of preparation and natural flying ability. Urbanovich brought his Hurricane home that afternoon with new respect for both the aircraft and the men who flew alongside him. The machine had performed exactly as designed, reliable, steady, and capable of absorbing the stresses of high-speed maneuvering without complaint. More importantly, the international cooperation that had seemed so tentative just weeks earlier was now functioning with increasing effectiveness. As evening approached and the Hurricane squadrons returned to their bases across southern England, maintenance crews were already preparing for the next day's operations. The aircraft would be refueled, rearmed, and inspected for damage. Pilots would attend briefings, study intelligence reports, and try to snatch a few hours of rest before dawn brought new challenges. But something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the battle. The Hurricane had proven itself not just as an aircraft, but as the foundation of a defensive system that was growing stronger with each passing day. In the capable hands of pilots like Urbanovich, it was becoming the instrument of Britain's survival, and perhaps the key to something approaching victory. Shared skies, shared courage. The bonds forged in those summer skies of 1940 extended far beyond the cockpit, reaching into every corner of the airfields where Britain's fate hung in the balance. In the dispersal huts scattered around bases like Northolt and Duxford, pilots from half a dozen nations found themselves sharing more than just tactical briefings and weather reports. They were sharing the peculiar intimacy that comes only to those who face death together each morning. The Polish pilots, initially viewed with polite skepticism by their RAF counterparts, had earned something far more valuable than acceptance. They had earned respect, and with it, the kind of friendship that transcends language barriers and cultural differences. Squadron leader Witold Urbanovich would later recall how Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a soft-spoken Yorkshireman with an accountant's precision for aerial gunnery, began teaching him the finer points of English idiom during the long hours between scrambles. "You see, Witold," Lacey would explain, using the anglicized pronunciation that had become standard, "when we say Jerry's bought it, we don't mean he's purchased anything at all." These conversations, conducted in the peculiar mixture of technical aviation English and broken colloquialisms, became the foundation of understanding that would prove as crucial as any tactical manual. The mechanics, those unsung architects of aerial victory, found their own ways of bridging national differences. Leading aircraftman Tommy Morrison, a Glaswegian with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, discovered that Sergeant Jan Kowalski from Krakow shared his obsession with the Hurricane's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Together, they would spend hours fine-tuning the carburetor mixture settings, adjusting propeller pitch, ensuring that every aircraft under their care delivered maximum performance when it mattered most. "The engine, she speaks the same language everywhere," Kowalski would say in his careful English, his hands moving with practiced precision over the Merlin's 12 cylinders. Morrison, initially suspicious of foreign interference with his aircraft, soon came to appreciate the Polish sergeant's almost mystical understanding of engine harmonics, the way he could diagnose a slight roughness in the idle that others might miss entirely. These technical partnerships extended throughout the ground crews. The armourers who loaded the 8-303 Browning machine guns, the riggers who checked control cables and fabric surfaces, the wireless mechanics who maintained the primitive but vital radio equipment, all found that competence and dedication spoke louder than accents or unfamiliar customs. The challenges faced by the Polish pilots in adapting to British military culture went far beyond language difficulties. The RAF's emphasis on formation flying and disciplined radio procedure clashed initially with the more individualistic combat style that had served the Poles well during their brief but fierce defense of their homeland. Flight Lieutenant Jan Zumbach, a pilot whose aggressive tactics had already earned him a reputation among the German formations, struggled with the measured approach favored by his British squadron commander. "In Poland, we learned to trust our instincts," Zumbach confided to his wingman during one of their evening walks around the perimeter of Northolt. "Here, everything must be, how do you say, by the book." His wingman, pilot officer David Hughes from Cardiff, understood the frustration. The British system, developed through years of peacetime training and refined by the harsh lessons of the Norwegian campaign, emphasized coordination over individual initiative, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, The two approaches began to merge into something more effective than either alone. The Polish pilots' aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft, tempered by British formation discipline, created a tactical flexibility that German bomber crews found increasingly difficult to counter. The measured British approach to interception, energized by Polish determination to engage at close range, resulted in higher kill ratios and fewer ammunition expenditures per victory. These evolving tactics were discussed not in formal briefing rooms, but in the local pubs that had become unofficial extensions of the airfield. The Rose and Crown in nearby Ruislip became a second home to pilots from Northolt, while the Eagle in Cambridge served the same function for the international squadron at Duxford. Here, over pints of bitter that the Polish pilots initially found bewildering, tactical innovations were born from casual conversation. The thing about the Heinkel 111, Flight Sergeant Stefan Witorsens would explain, sketching aircraft profiles on beer-stained napkins, is the blind spot beneath the rear gunner's position. If you approach from below and slightly to port, his audience of British and Czech pilots would lean in, absorbing lessons learned in the crucible of actual combat. These informal tactical seminars, conducted in the warm glow of pub lighting with the comforting sounds of rural England just outside, became as valuable as any official training program. The pub conversations also revealed the deeper currents of motivation that drove these men to climb into their hurricanes each morning. For the British pilots, the war was about defending home and hearth, protecting the familiar landscapes and cherished institutions that defined their identity. For the Poles, Czechs, and Free French, the motivation carried an additional weight: the burning desire to liberate homelands already under Nazi occupation. This difference in perspective created a unique dynamic within the squadrons. The British pilots, fighting over their own soil, drew strength from the knowledge that their families were just miles away, that victory meant preserving everything they held dear. The foreign pilots, fighting above a landscape that was not their own, carried the heavier burden of knowing that defeat meant not just personal death, but the permanent loss of their nation's freedom. Yet rather than creating division, these different motivations seemed to reinforce each other. British pilots found their own resolve strengthened by the example of men who had already lost everything, who continued fighting with nothing but hope and determination. The foreign pilots, in turn, drew inspiration from their British comrades' calm confidence, their unshakable belief that the island fortress they all defended would ultimately prevail. These bonds were tested daily, not just in combat, but in the quieter moments that revealed character. When pilot officer Tadeusz Savage received word that his family in Warsaw had disappeared during the German occupation, it was his British squadron mates who sat with him through the long night, offering what comfort they could in a situation that had no comfort to offer. When Flight Lieutenant Peter Brothers was shot down over Kent and spent 2 days evading German search parties, it was Jan Zumbach who violated orders to conduct unauthorized reconnaissance flights, searching for any sign of his missing friend. The mechanics and ground crews developed their own traditions of mutual support. When supplies of Polish cigarettes, those precious links to home, ran short, the British airmen would share their player's navy cut without question. When a British fitter's wife gave birth while he was on duty during a particularly intense period of operations, it was the Polish mechanics who worked double shifts, ensuring that his aircraft remained serviceable while he spent precious hours with his new family. These small acts of solidarity, unremarkable in themselves, created a fabric of trust that proved as durable as the Hurricane's stressed skin construction. The international squadrons were becoming something unprecedented in military aviation, truly integrated fighting units where nationality mattered less than competence, where shared danger had created shared identity. As August 1940 drew toward its climactic battles, the pilots and ground crews scattered across Fighter Command's airfields had become more than allies of convenience. They had become, through the alchemy of shared purpose and mutual respect, a brotherhood of the air that would prove unbreakable in the trials ahead. Erne, the Ace's resolve. The brotherhood forged in those summer weeks would soon face its ultimate test, but first it would be defined by the actions of one extraordinary pilot whose name would become legend among those who flew with him. Sergeant Józef František arrived at RAF Northolt on a rain-soaked morning in late August, carrying little more than a worn leather flight bag and a reputation that preceded him like thunder. The Czech pilot had already fought the Luftwaffe over France, had escaped through the chaos of Dunkirk, and now assigned to number 303 Polish Squadron, he brought with him an intensity that even the battle-hardened Polish veterans found remarkable. František was different. Where other pilots flew with calculated aggression, he flew with something approaching fury. Not the wild, undisciplined rage that got pilots killed, but a cold, methodical anger that made him perhaps the most dangerous fighter pilot in the entire Royal Air Force. His fellow Poles watched him with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing in him something they had all felt but few had channeled so completely. In the squadron briefing room at Northolt, a converted Nissen hut that smelled perpetually of cigarettes, aviation fuel, and damp wool, Squadron leader Ronald Kellett would outline the day's operations while František sat in the back corner, studying intelligence photographs with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The Czech pilot had developed his own system for analyzing Luftwaffe formations, noting the subtle variations in German tactics that others might miss. The 109s are flying higher escort now, František would observe in his careful English, pointing to reconnaissance photos spread across the briefing table. See here, and here, they are learning that our Spitfires climb better than they expected. But this creates, how do you say, opportunity. His tactical insights were invariably correct. František had an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of German formations, to anticipate where the Stukas would turn for their bombing runs, to predict which Messerschmitt pilots would break formation first under pressure. It was as if he could think like his enemies, could see the battle from their perspective and use that knowledge against them. But it was in the air that František truly distinguished himself. While other pilots flew as part of coordinated formations, following established tactics and maintaining radio discipline, František operated as a lone predator within the larger pack. He would spot a weakness in the German formation, peel away from his squadron mates, and strike with devastating precision before anyone realized what had happened. On the morning of September 2, 1940, as radar chain home stations along the Kent coast detected another massive German raid building over Calais, František's unique approach to aerial combat would be displayed in its full lethal effectiveness. The scramble came at 10:47 hours. 12 Hurricanes of 303 Squadron clawed for altitude above the Thames estuary, climbing through broken cloud toward an intercept with what radar operators estimated as 40-plus bandits inbound toward the London docks. František, flying as Red 3, maintained perfect formation discipline during the climb, but his radio crackled with terse observations that revealed his tactical mind already working. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, Stukas with close escort, medium escort at Angels 2-0, high cover stepping down from Angels 2-5. His voice carried no excitement, no tension, just the flat professional tone of a man cataloguing targets. Squadron leader Kellett acknowledged the sighting and began positioning the squadron for a classic beam attack on the Stuka formation. Standard fighter command doctrine called for a coordinated approach, all 12 Hurricanes hitting the dive bombers simultaneously to disrupt their attack before they could reach the docks. But František had seen something else. As the squadron maneuvered into attack position, he spotted a flight of 4 Messerschmitt 109s that had separated from the main escort, positioning themselves to bounce any RAF fighters that committed to attacking the Stukas. It was a clever trap, and one that could cost 303 Squadron dearly. Without breaking radio silence, without alerting the German pilots to his intentions, František eased his Hurricane into a shallow dive that took him away from his squadron mates and toward the waiting Messerschmitts. To the German pilots, he appeared to be a single Hurricane that had become separated from its formation, an easy target. They took the bait. The lead 109 rolled into a diving attack on František's Hurricane, followed by his wingman, while the second element moved to cut off any escape route. It was a textbook 4 versus 1 engagement that should have ended with a dead RAF pilot and a confirmed kill for the Luftwaffe. Instead, it became a masterclass in fighter tactics that would be discussed in squadron briefing rooms for the rest of the war. František allowed the German formation to commit fully to their attack, let them believe they had trapped him, then executed a maneuver that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His Hurricane snapped into a vertical climbing turn that brought him face to face with the lead Messerschmitt, guns blazing at point-blank range. The German pilot never had time to react. František's 8 machine guns stitched a devastating pattern across the 109's engine cowling and cockpit, sending the aircraft spinning toward the Thames in a trail of smoke and flame. Before the remaining Germans could reposition, František had rolled inverted and dove beneath their formation, pulling up behind the second element with deadly precision. 2 more bursts, 2 more Messerschmitts falling toward the English countryside, and the surviving German pilot fleeing toward France with František's bullets chasing him across the channel. The entire engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. By the time František rejoined his squadron, 303 Squadron had successfully broken up the Stuka attack and was reforming for the flight back to Northolt. 3 confirmed kills, no losses, and a tactical victory that prevented significant damage to the London docks. But it was František's individual action that captured the attention of Fighter Command headquarters. Here was a pilot who could not only hold his own against superior numbers, but could turn the tactical situation to his advantage through pure skill and aggressive flying. Word of the Czech sergeant's exploits began spreading through the RAF's informal communication network, the pub conversations and mess hall discussions that carried news faster than any official report. British pilots who had initially viewed their foreign colleagues with polite skepticism now spoke of František with something approaching awe. Here was aerial combat reduced to its purest essence, individual skill and determination overcoming numerical disadvantage through sheer professional excellence. As September 1940 continued its relentless progression toward the climactic battles that would decide Britain's fate, pilots like Joseph František represented something more than military assets. They embodied the transformation of Fighter Command itself, from a collection of individual squadrons into a truly integrated fighting force where excellence transcended nationality, where shared purpose had created unbreakable bonds of professional respect. Turning tides. The bonds forged in those September skies would face their ultimate test on what historians would later recognize as the most decisive day of the entire campaign. September 15, 1940. A date that would forever mark the turning point when Hitler's dreams of aerial supremacy finally shattered against the coordinated defense that Dowding had so carefully constructed. The morning dawned clear across southern England, offering perfect visibility for what the Luftwaffe intended as their knockout blow. Intelligence intercepts had revealed German confidence, their belief that Fighter Command was down to its last few squadrons. Hermann Göring himself had assured his pilots that one more massive effort would sweep the remaining RAF defenders from the skies. But as the first formations of Dornier bombers assembled over the Pas de Calais, escorted by unprecedented numbers of Messerschmitt fighters, they faced a defensive system that had evolved far beyond their understanding. The radar stations along Britain's coast tracked every movement with precision. The operations rooms hummed with quiet efficiency as controllers positioned their pieces across the aerial chessboard. Squadron leader Urbanowicz received his scramble order at 11:15, leading his Polish pilots into the morning sky with the calm professionalism that had become their trademark. Across Kent and Surrey, British squadrons climbed toward their assigned patrol lines. The international character of Fighter Command was now complete. Polish voices mixing with Czech accents and British drawls over the radio frequencies as pilots reported their positions. The first wave struck just before noon, over 200 German aircraft crossing the channel in tight formation. But instead of finding scattered resistance, they encountered layer upon layer of coordinated defense. Hurricanes attacked the bomber formations while Spitfires engaged the escort fighters at altitude. The careful training, the shared tactical knowledge, the bonds of professional respect, all crystallized into devastating effectiveness. Josef František, flying with his characteristic aggressive precision, led a diving attack that broke up an entire bomber formation before it could reach its target. His radio calls, calm and methodical despite the chaos around him, guided other pilots to advantageous positions. The shy Czech pilot, who had once struggled with English, now commanded respect through actions that spoke louder than words. But September 15th held more than one act in its drama. As the morning raid limped back across the channel, leaving behind scattered wreckage and parachutes drifting down over the English countryside. Radar operators detected an even larger formation assembling over France. The afternoon would bring the true test. At 2:30, nearly 400 German aircraft began their approach, the largest daylight raid yet attempted. Every available RAF squadron scrambled to meet them. Pilots who had fought that morning climbed once again into their cockpits, fatigue pushed aside by the knowledge that this moment would determine everything. The battle that followed stretched across the entire southeastern sky. From Dover to London, from Canterbury to Portsmouth, individual combats merged into a vast aerial engagement that tested every lesson learned over the preceding months. British pilots applied the tactical innovations suggested by their Polish colleagues. Czech pilots flew with the disciplined coordination they had absorbed from RAF training. The synthesis of different national approaches had created something more effective than any single tradition. Squadron after squadron met the German formations, not piecemeal as in the early days of the battle, but in carefully coordinated waves that maximized their impact. The Hurricane pilots concentrated on the bombers while Spitfire squadrons held the escort fighters at bay. Radio discipline, so carefully developed through weeks of joint operations, allowed controllers to direct reinforcements precisely where needed. By 4 o'clock, the German formations were in full retreat, their tight discipline shattered by the intensity of the defense they had encountered. Bomber crews jettisoned their loads over empty countryside, desperate to gain altitude and speed for the Channel crossing. Fighter pilots, low on fuel and ammunition, abandoned their charges to save themselves. As evening fell over the English countryside, the true magnitude of the day's victory became clear. The Luftwaffe had lost 60 aircraft. More importantly, they had lost the illusion of inevitable triumph that had sustained their campaign. The RAF had demonstrated not just survival, but mastery. The ability to meet Germany's maximum effort and turn it back decisively. In squadron dispersal huts across southern England, pilots gathered for the evening ritual of debriefing and quiet celebration. The international character of these gatherings had become so natural that nationality seemed almost irrelevant. Polish pilots shared cigarettes with their British colleagues. Czech voices joined in the traditional toasts. The barriers that had once seemed so significant had dissolved completely in the crucible of shared purpose. September 15th marked more than a tactical victory. It represented the moment when Hitler's invasion plans began their inevitable slide toward cancellation, when the tide of war began its slow but irreversible turn toward eventual Allied triumph. Echoes in the sky. The echoes of that September victory would ripple forward through time, carrying with them the voices of men who had found brotherhood in the vast cathedral of sky above southern England. In the weeks that followed, as autumn deepened into the quiet certainty of survival, those who had fought together began to understand the true magnitude of what they had accomplished. The airfields grew quieter as the immediate crisis passed. Biggin Hill, Northolt, the scattered bases that had served as launching points for desperate interceptions, now settled into the rhythm of vigilant but less frantic operations. Polish pilots walked the same dispersal areas where they had once waited for scramble calls, their footsteps echoing across concrete that had witnessed the forging of an alliance none of them could have imagined just months before. In the evening light, when the last patrols returned and the Spitfires and Hurricanes stood silent in their revetments, the true cost of victory became visible in the empty spaces. Beds that would remain forever unoccupied, lockers containing personal effects that would be carefully packed and sent to families in occupied Poland. Photographs of young men whose laughter would exist now only in the memories of their surviving colleagues. Yet even in grief, the bonds forged in combat proved unbreakable. British squadron leaders who had once questioned the reliability of foreign pilots now spoke with quiet pride of their Polish and Czech comrades. The skepticism that had marked those early encounters in July seemed like artifacts from another age, replaced by a professional respect that transcended national boundaries and would endure long after the war's end. The transformation had been profound and irreversible. Fighter command had evolved from a collection of individual squadrons into something unprecedented in military history. A truly international air force where tactical innovations flowed freely between cultures, where Polish aggression tempered British caution, where Czech precision enhanced overall effectiveness. The language barriers that had once complicated radio communications had given way to a shared vocabulary of aerial combat, a professional shorthand that needed no translation. In the quiet moments between operations, when pilots gathered in dispersal huts or village pubs, conversations revealed the depth of change that had occurred. British pilots spoke admiringly of Polish tactics, of the way Urbanowicz could read an enemy formation's intentions, of František's uncanny ability to appear exactly where German fighters least expected him. The foreign pilots, in turn, expressed genuine appreciation for the systematic approach of their British colleagues, for Dowding's strategic vision that had made their individual skills part of a larger defensive masterpiece. These relationships would outlast the immediate crisis. Letters would cross the Atlantic in later years, carrying news of peacetime careers and growing families, maintaining connections forged in the crucible of combat. Polish pilots who eventually settled in Britain would name their children after British comrades. British veterans would speak with lifelong admiration of the courage displayed by men fighting for a homeland they might never see free again. The September victory had proven something fundamental about human nature under extreme pressure. When survival itself hung in the balance, when the choice was between cooperation and defeat, the barriers that normally divided people could dissolve with remarkable speed. Language, culture, national prejudice, all had proven secondary to the shared commitment to defend something larger than individual concerns. As winter approached and the immediate threat of invasion receded, the airfields of southern England settled into a different kind of vigilance. The desperate scrambles became less frequent, the radar plots less urgent, but the bonds between the men who had answered those calls remained as strong as ever. They had discovered something precious in those summer and autumn skies, a brotherhood that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and politics. The empty chairs at briefing tables served as quiet reminders of the price paid for that discovery. Young men from Warsaw and Prague, from London and Edinburgh, had given their lives to prove that common cause could overcome any division. Their sacrifice had purchased not just Britain's survival, but a template for international cooperation that would echo through the decades to come. In the gathering dusk of those autumn evenings, as the last light faded from runways that had witnessed history's turning, the surviving pilots understood that they had been part of something extraordinary. They had proven that when humanity faces its greatest challenges, when the stakes rise beyond individual concern, the bonds that unite people prove stronger than the forces that divide them. And in that understanding, in the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and brotherhood discovered, they found a peace that would carry them gently into whatever dreams awaited, knowing that they had answered when history called, and that their answer had been enough.